Well, good afternoon. My name is Steve Wilkins. On behalf of the Philosophy Department, we'd like to welcome you here. So in addition to this special event we're going to have today, every year we have a guest lecturer come in, bring in one of the most prominent Christian philosophers who is available out there for a couple of lectures. And so that program is called the Sophia Forum. And this year we are bringing in Robin Collins, who has done a lot of work on the fine-tuning argument for God's existence. And so he will be presenting two lectures on February 10th. So get that on your schedules. And I'm going to turn it over to David Woodruff, who's our department chair.
Good afternoon, and again, welcome. A couple of things that I wanted to mention. One is there is a sign-up sheet for those of you who need to sign up. And of course, you can always take a picture and prove that you were here with your professor with a picture. Others of you I know have assignments to do based upon the lecture, so that's fine. I also wanted to mention that in addition to our special opportunities for lectures by today Josh Rasmussen and in the spring by Robin Collins, we also have the opportunity to focus more closely on some of these things. We offer a minor in apologetics, which is directly connected to what we're talking about today. Apologetics is defense of the belief in the existence of God. We offer a minor in practical and professional ethics. We offer just a simple minor in philosophy, as if that's simple, and a major in philosophy. So if you find these things interesting, we'd invite you to check out some of those things. Today, however, I have the special honor of being able to introduce a good friend, Josh Rasmussen. Josh has been at Azusa Pacific for 10 years, and that was following a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship at Notre Dame. Josh has taken the time to write 7 books. He has 45 professional articles published in professional journals. For those of you who don't know, that involves submitting an article and having it be blind reviewed by reviewers to assess the appropriateness or value of it. He has 75 plus media appearances on podcasts, ranging from podcasts to radio shows, 30 plus book interviews. To say he's been busy is to understate things in a radical way. Okay, and 5 kids. I didn't really want to push that, but yes. Some of his book titles are Who Are You Really? The Bridge to Reason, 10 Steps to God, Necessary Existence. Some of his journal articles that I thought were appropriate or interesting for this topic was Why Is There Anything at All? Timeless Times. I, of course, find that interesting. And God Exists. Today his talk is Does God Exist? A Philosopher's Journey to God by the Light of Reason. Please welcome Josh Rasmussen.
Well, thank you guys for coming out. I'm very, very excited about this presentation. This is kind of a signature message for me. And I was kind of thinking, even as I was preparing it, how I can have a purpose that's going to be of value to you. And so I begin my presentation by telling you my purpose. My purpose in life, at least my purpose in this place here, is to provide some encouragement for you in your life by the illumination of a great treasure by the light of reason. So this is my goal. This is something that I aspire to do, is to encourage people using the tools of philosophy, using the tools of truth-seeking, careful analysis, making observations through all of the data sets that we have available, and then analyzing those observations in a way that can help us to have some deep insights about the nature of reality, who we are, why we're here, and to do this in a way that can inspire curiosity, as well as to inspire you to kind of think anew about the familiar things. Like, why does anything exist? Or like, who are you really? These things are so familiar that there are things that exist, that there are people that exist, but the familiar things are not thereby insignificant. In fact, I would argue that probably some of the most significant pieces of reality are the most familiar to you, including your own self. So this is my goal, my big goal for this presentation. But let me just say that sometimes if I have a goal or a desire or a hope, that hope doesn't actually match with actual reality. I'm sure you can relate to this. When I was in high school, I began having conversations about big questions. This was in a biology class. I was having some conversations with some friends about the universe coming into existence and what made the universe, why the universe exists. And I found those conversations just so interesting because I had a worldview that was given to me by my family, my community, that made me feel safe, made me feel like there was purpose, made me feel like I was loved by God. But the questions caused me to become curious about what's actually true. Is the community that I was raised in, are my family's beliefs, do those actually match up with reality? And as I began to investigate this, I remember watching a documentary by Stephen Hawking on the origin of the universe, and he was talking with other scientists, and he seemed like a very honest truth seeker. He wanted to get to the truth about what made the universe. And I remember he described the universe as a kind of a closed system that didn't need to be caused or produced by anything else. And even though I had some arguments in my mind for why maybe the universe would have to be produced, those arguments really weren't so clear to me. And so then I started having some questions, and once my questions came in, more questions came in. I began thinking about people from different religions and different cultures. I began thinking about children who get into floods and die. I began thinking about just the problems of life, and I began to realize that I couldn't just make reality what I want it to be. Reality is, if it's like a wave, it just rolls away. I can't just think, okay, I hope this is true because that would make me feel happy. But instead, I have to actually find out what's actually true. So this was a kind of painful experience, but also, let me say that some fruits came out of this. A few things that I appreciate about this experience. First, it gave me a greater appreciation for people with different perspectives, for me to learn from others, for me to realize what it's like from the outside of the upbringing perspective that I was raised in, what it's like to view that perspective from the outside. I began to be able to experience that, which gave me compassion. I also felt like this helped me to appreciate the value of truth in a way that I didn't appreciate before. I remember there was this moment where I realized that I had a choice to make. I could either try to defend beliefs that I wanted to be true, or I could go out like an explorer on a boat into a big ocean and just go try to find out more truth. And I just remember deciding, I even told some friends, that I would rather pursue the truth and get to truths that I don't want to be true than to kind of blind myself to reality, trying to comfort my own self. And so what happened out of this is a realization that reality is bigger, greater, grandeur, more special than I had realized. And what I want to do is present to you some steps in a journey for how I've come to see that reality actually is bigger and more special than many of us realize. So flowers grow in the soil of doubt. If you're feeling doubts about things, if you have questions, don't feel like that's a bad thing. Actually, wisdom flows out of the tension from those doubts, and you're going to get more wisdom no matter what you look into. So I began to look more closely into these questions about the nature of reality. And this is a journey that has not stopped. I mean, I'm a philosopher. I continue to expand, update my views on things, even in conversations with students, professional philosophers, as I'm reading more and more books and recent developments in the sciences. I continue to rethink certain things and turn over new pieces. And I love it because the result of it is a greater vision of reality, of the truth. So I went deeper. In early college, I went to the library. I checked out a bunch of books on the existence of God. I remember finding some books by atheists arguing against the existence of God. I wanted to make sure that I was reading, the best defenders of a view that maybe I didn't want to be true, but I wanted just to see, okay, what are the arguments for this? What's the actual truth? Different philosophers. Antony Flew was a philosopher that I read. He was arguing for atheism. He made an argument that the existence of God, the question of God's existence may not even be intelligible, may not even be meaningful. And he had some interesting science arguments for that, philosophy of science arguments. J.L. Mackie, Quentin Smith, Kai Nielsen, other philosophers. I also found a book by a philosopher named William Rowe, who has a book called The Cosmological Argument. I found this book quite interesting because Rowe is writing this argument for God, but he's not coming at this from a theist perspective, he himself not being a theist. And so it made me curious, also kind of added a little bit of credibility to the book, because one of my worries was that people are trying to reinforce what they want to believe, so they're kind of rationalizing prior beliefs. So I began to go very deep into my studies, and the result of this is what I want to call a bridge of reason. So I'm just super excited to share with you the steps on this bridge of reason. This is a step-by-step guide to what I'm going to call a treasure. And each step is based on reason and observation. And my goal is to kind of share with you my own journey from my own perspective, what it's like to be me, and then invite you to own the journey from your perspective. There are some things that I may share tonight that maybe don't click with you, or that doesn't quite seem true. That's okay. Follow the light of reason as you see it, because you're going to learn the most if you follow your own lights. This has been my own story. This has been my own experience, is that as I would follow the lights, I would be able to see more and more. That's going to be most helpful to you. So I invite you to own the journey, to kind of put on those critical thinking hats as I go through the different steps, and come up with objections or things that you might question. At the end of this time, we'll have opportunity for you to ask some questions. Also, each one of these steps could involve books and classes of time to really draw attention to it. So this is just going to be kind of an introduction to the Bridge of Reason. Also kind of sharing my own experience as I've walked through these steps. So the first step on the bridge, I call this existence. According to this step, something exists. Now, why think something exists? Well, I've got an argument for you. Arguments are the love language of philosophers, by the way. If nothing exists, then you don't exist. You exist. Therefore, something exists. Now, some of you might be doubting the second premise, that you exist. If you happen to be doubting that premise, then at least your doubts exist. After all, you're doubting the premise, and that's enough to get to the conclusion that something exists. I make no assumption here about the nature of what exists. Some people have wondered, maybe everything's an illusion. Okay, well then illusions exist. All that I claim here is that there's something. And the experience of your own self having questions is already enough to verify the reality of something. I begin here because I want to begin with what I think is a kind of universal observation that probably most people could accept, although I did find a philosophy article challenging this conclusion. Philosophers will be philosophers after all. I don't think even the author of that article was convinced by his argument. This is a premise I think most people would accept. And if you do accept this premise, then welcome to the Bridge of Reason. You've taken the first step. The second step is about a puzzle. So the goal here is to show that there's a question and just to understand what this question is. The question is about existence. Why does anything at all exist? Why is there anything rather than just like nothing? This is one of those questions that can startle you at night. Like if you go to sleep and then you kind of wake up in the middle of the night and the familiar things start feeling strange to you and you're like, oh, things exist. Why do things exist? Why is there anything? Why isn't there just blank, like nothing, forever and ever and ever? Have you ever wondered this? Why is there anything? Now, a reason why I say that this is a puzzle, this question leads to a puzzle, is that normally we expect that things that exist have an explanation of their existence. So if this puzzle piece represents reality in its totality, I mean, imagine that reality in its totality actually looks like this. I mean, who knows what it looks like, right? I mean, we haven't ventured out, but maybe we're in a multiverse and each little pixel is one universe. And all the pixels, all the universes together look like a giant puzzle piece. Whatever reality looks like, whether it looks like a puzzle piece, a turtle, or just some kind of giant collection of things, you can ask the question, why do those things exist? But wait a second, there can't be an explanation of the existence of all of reality that itself doesn't already exist. So like if we're trying to explain why does anything exist, there's a puzzle because in order to give an explanation of why anything exists, we have to appeal to something that exists to explain why anything exists. And that's circular. To put this another way, normally things have outside explanations or causes, right? So you see things in the room. These things didn't just come into being from nothing. Something produced them. Something outside of them made them. So if reality in total exists, then something outside reality in total had to make it. But this contradicts logic because there's nothing outside of reality in total. Reality in total includes all things. So this leads to a deep question about how can there even be a reality? Sometimes in my classes I like to present the argument for the existence of nothing, which is the argument that if something exists, there has to be an explanation of the total reality. There can't possibly be an explanation of the total reality, therefore nothing exists. Of course, that's going to contradict the first step on the bridge of reason. Something exists. So it's not the answer that I want to give here. Instead, I want to look more closely at this puzzle, and this is going to lead us to step 3. So step 2 is just understanding the question. Step 3 provides an answer to the question. I call this answer the foundation theory. The answer is that something exists on its own. It's foundational to everything else. So we can divide things into 2 categories. Some things depend on other things. These are familiar things that we're aware of. You know, like if there's a book, this book depends on something else. And then, well, what does it depend on? Maybe an author, something that produced it. But in order for there to be a reality in total, I argue there's got to be some foundational thing that can exist all on its own. It doesn't have any outside cause or explanation. It provides the ultimate cause of everything else. I make no assumption about the size of reality. Reality could be infinite in size. I make no assumption about the age of reality. Reality could be infinite in age. Maybe the universe is eternal. That's fine. No matter how big the universe is, no matter how old it is, my argument is that there's got to be something foundational in order for there to be existence at all. So a foundation of reality would explain how there could be anything at all. I have 2 supports for this I'm going to share here. These aren't my only supports, but these are 2 that I'm going to offer you. First, I offer you a principle of dependence. The principle says that no total of purely dependent things can explain its own existence, but must depend on something prior. Or in other words, dependent things add up to dependent totals. The total is dependent, and it's going to have to depend on something prior. To illustrate this, you might think of the turtles being dependent on each other or on something. It doesn't matter how many turtles there are, even if there's infinitely many turtles. Those turtles, the infinite chunk of turtles, is going to depend on something else. Another way of illustrating this is to consider where this book came from. And here's a story, because you haven't seen the origin of this book. I mean, so you don't know. So I could just tell you a story. So here's a story. This book was copied from a copy of this book. And the copy of the book was copied from a prior copy. And the prior copy was copied from a prior copy all the way to infinity. This copying has been happening from eternity. Do you believe that story? Well, if you did believe that story, you may not believe that story. You might think there's some original author of this book. But if you did believe that story, you might still wonder, why is there that infinite chain of copying books at all? Why are there those books at all? And the principle of dependence tells us that if the dependent things depend on things, then the dependent chain also depends on something beyond it, which means that the total of dependent things has to depend on something beyond the dependent things, which is foundational and not dependent. Okay, are you guys with me? So the idea is there's a foundational thing that's not dependent that allows there to be dependent things. To kind of reinforce this idea, I offer a second principle. This is a bit more modest. This principle just says that we can expect a possible explanation of anything by default. So to unpack this a bit, if you have no reason to think that there cannot be some further explanation of the things in question, then by the track record of your experience with explanations, you can expect that probably, other things being equal, there can be a further explanation. So, if you see this book here and you don't know where it came from, you don't know the explanation of its existence, you don't have to thereby be agnostic about whether it has some explanation, because the track record of experience is going to give you some reason to expect there's probably some further explanation of this book. Unless you have an independent reason that tells you that this is a very special book, I mean, it is a special book, but It's so special that it couldn't possibly be created. This is the one book that is foundational. This is the uncaused cause of everything else. Unless you have some reason to think that, the default assumption, the default reason is to expect a further explanation. This, I think, is how science operates. We expect explanations of our observations. This is why we come up with hypotheses that describe things we don't even see with our eyes. It's because those hypotheses explain what we do see with our eyes. This is based on the principle of explanation. So these independently and collectively support the foundation theory, that reality has some foundation. I think this is a very important part of the Bridge of Reason because every step after this is about investigating the nature of this foundation. What is this foundation? So here we are so far. We've made it to the foundation step, and we're going to continue along this bridge to see what else we can say about the foundation. So the next step is eternal power. And again, as I said, this is a kind of abbreviated summary. It's kind of an outline of the bridge. Each one of these steps could invite many questions. But these steps, I think, can be investigated through the light of reason. So the foundation has power. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that it has an ability to cause or make or ground or explain dependent things. So it's the foundation of the rest of reality. And so by definition, in order to be the foundation of the rest of reality, it has this kind of power or ability to be the foundation of reality. Now here's an argument for its power being eternal. Its power doesn't come to be or cease to be. The argument is this: if the foundation's power is not eternal, then this power depends on a prior power. The idea here is that things don't just begin to be without some kind of prior cause or explanation. This is why we never see like random blue balls just appearing from nothing without any prior cause or explanation. Same with powers. Powers don't just come to be without a prior cause or explanation. So if there's a power that comes to be, then there's got to be a prior cause of that power. But then that means that prior cause has to have some power, some ability to produce that power. So if the foundation's power is not eternal, then this power depends on a prior power. But the foundation's power does not depend on a prior power because it's foundational. It's the foundation's power. This is the foundation of all of reality. The foundation's power is the power that explains the rest of things. And so there's nothing behind the foundation that could give it its power. If there were, then that thing behind the foundation would be the foundation. And then its power would be the foundational power. So I think that these premises are supported by our experience with cause and effect, as well as just unpacking the definitions of the terms. And we get that the foundation's power is eternal. Now, so far, you could be thinking, okay, well, what is this foundational power? Is it energy? Is it matter? All of that's left open so far. We're going to take another step. We're going to see if we can investigate this further. This is what you might think of as the most abstract step, but it's a very important step. This step in the argument says that the foundation's essence, what it is, what it must be, its very nature, is full and complete, meaning that it doesn't have arbitrary edges that it could transcend or boundaries that it could transcend in its essence. The idea here is that whatever it is, it's not going to be limited in some particular finite ways. Why do I say this? Well, here's some motivation. I'll give you two motivations. So first, the edges and boundaries can have a further explanation in terms of prior causes. But the fundamental reality cannot have prior causes because it's fundamental. Now, why do I say the edges and boundaries can have a further explanation in terms of prior causes? Well, now I'm going to appeal again to that principle of explanation that we looked at earlier. Expect an explanation as far as you can. So unless you have some reason to think that there's some special shape or some special book that could just exist without any further cause, you have a reason based on the track record of your experience to expect a further explanation. Let me just say that this is one of those arguments that has grown on me over the years. I think initially, back when I was in college, I remember being kind of skeptical, like maybe these things have a cause, maybe not. But it wasn't really until I got to graduate school when I started to think about relevant differences between things that are caused and something that could be uncaused. That it just clicked in my mind that, oh, if this book has to have a cause, then merely changing its shape, making it slightly bigger or slightly smaller, is not going to be a relevant difference to make it so that, oh, now it can be uncaused. Mere changes in shape are not relevant to whether it can be caused or uncaused. And for this reason, then I would say that any particular shape it has, that shape's going to have to be caused. Now, because this is a very abstract argument, I'm going to try to make this more concrete for you by presenting one of my favorite arguments in philosophy, what I call the turtle argument. So the turtle argument is an argument about turtles. The essence of a turtle includes boundaries and edges. Okay, turtles are finite beings. They have a certain number of legs, a certain mass, certain size. Turtles aren't infinite beings. Okay? It's part of what it is to be a turtle, to have boundaries and edges. But the foundation's essence does not include boundaries or edges because it's purely actual. Again, the argument is that for any edge or boundary it has, there's got to be some further cause or explanation of that boundary, but there's no further cause of the foundation of all causes because it's the foundation. So we can now conclude using reason that the foundation of all of reality is not a turtle. And I think that's pretty exciting, you know. We can investigate the fundamental reality by using our observations in science to recognize that there are explanations of things. And there's explanations of turtles. So the foundation of all reality can't be a turtle because it has no prior cause or explanation. Now, this is just one example. You can play with this for yourself, you know, see if you can think of other conclusions that you can draw. You might be able to infer things like the foundation of reality is not a snake, it's not a chair, it's not a planet, it's not a blue cube, because all those things have boundaries and limitations, but the essence of the foundational reality has no boundaries or limitations, again, because those things would have a further cause or explanation. All right, so here we're making progress across the bridge, and we have a few more steps. I'm going to go through these next steps rather quickly in a kind of abbreviated way. These are very important steps about the connection between the foundation and the effects that we see. But I want to kind of just illustrate sort of a general set of considerations. So there's mind, matter, morals, math, and reason. All those things seem to exist. So the foundation has to somehow be a foundation for mind, matter, morals, math, and reason, somehow. So let's just have a look at mind first. Let's say that you have an assignment. Your job, you'll be paid $1 million if you can do this, is to take some of this sand and turn it into a conscious being who's having feelings of curiosity. Okay, that's your assignment. What do you do? How do you get started? Many philosophers have made the argument that actually you could never complete this assignment. It's actually impossible. There are different reasons for this. I want to kind of point to 3 general problems. These aren't the only problems. One problem is what Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. This is the problem of explaining how changes in sand could result in experiential changes of what it's like to be you, what it's like to smell coffee, what it feels like to hope for something. That no mere description of sand and its spatial relations is going to explain the emergence of consciousness. So this is a hard problem of consciousness. And a number of philosophers are led by the hard problem to think that maybe some form of consciousness is actually fundamental to reality because it can't be made out of mindless bits. A second related problem is called the binding problem. The binding problem has to do with not just how to make consciousness, but how to have a unified conscious experience so that your thoughts and feelings and emotions and the different elements in your own consciousness are in your consciousness. It's not that some grains of sand have the thoughts, some grains of sand have the feelings, some grains of sand have the emotions, some grains of sand have the images of purple dragons rotating in their minds. Well, once you have the bits of sand having all those things, how do you make a being that unifies it into one experience? This is the binding problem. Some philosophers have argued that you can't build a unification just from scratch, from taking mindless bits and organizing them. It's impossible. A third kind of problem is called causal exclusion. This has to do with the power to make decisions through intentions. So probably you had the experience of like intending to do something. I'm going to just do this for myself now. I'm going to intend to raise my hand. Okay, I just did it, so I just had the experience of intending to do something. Jaegwon Kim makes the argument that in order for you to intend to do something in a way that actually makes a difference to the material world, there has to be something about you that's not causally excluded by mindless bits of reality pulling all the strings on your behavior. In other words, you have to have a kind of power yourself that's not already determined by the physics operating on the mindless bits of matter. And so this has led some philosophers to think that there's a problem with building conscious beings who can do something through intentions just out of sand. Like even if you could make the sand conscious, and even if you could bind it together into a unified experience, you wouldn't be able to have a real actor in the world that can make its own decisions. That would be impossible. So for these reasons, some philosophers have said that the foundation of reality has consciousness. Consciousness is not built up piecemeal out of mindless things, but it has a kind of fundamental mind. But for the sake of modesty and to appeal to a broad audience, I'm going to just say that the foundation has some way of making mind, some mind-making resources, has some way of forming conscious beings. And I'm not going to say how, so I'm just going to kind of leave that open in this step. Somehow there are minds, there's a foundation, so the foundation is a foundation of minds. I'm also going to leave open, just to make it this very clear, whether the foundation directly causes minds or indirectly causes them through a complex sequence. All that, I'm just going to leave that open for sake of neutrality. Foundation of matter. So matter exists. Imagine that the scientists get to the edge of our universe. Imagine that this is our universe right here. And they discover, to their great surprise, that our universe looks like a hand. But then they get outside the universe, they discover, oh, there's other universes. And they also look like hands. And all the universes together, the multiverse, looks like a hand. You might wonder what explains this configuration of matter. Now, there's a similar question that comes up, and this is what Robin Collins is going to talk about when he comes to give his talk on the fine-tuning of the universe. And this has to do with getting the matter in the right configurations, not for the universe itself to look like a hand, but for hands to come to exist anywhere in the universe. So it turns out that getting hands to exist is not just a trivial thing. If you take a random reality out of a hat, that random reality is not just automatically going to include hands. And some of the developments in science seem to suggest that many things about our universe have to be within very finely tuned conditions. The expansion rate of the universe, if the universe expands slightly faster, it expands too fast to form planets and places for beings to exist. If it expands more slowly, then it collapses in on itself. So then again, there's not going to be places for people to exist. Robin Collins makes the argument that even if there are many universes, the multiverse would have to be finely tuned for any universe to contain a hand in it. And he has a very technical way of making this argument precise. He compares the fine-tuning to throwing a dart across the universe and hitting a small target. Or I think it's across the galaxy. You're probably not going to hit that small target just by chance or just by accident because it's such a small target. And this suggests to some that maybe the foundation actually has the power of a mind again, the power to intend. So that the universe having life forms in it is not just by chance, that actually it's a result of this intention. In fact, I mentioned earlier in this talk Antony Flew, one of the atheist philosophers that I read when I was in college, arguing for atheism, or maybe even against the very intelligibility of the concept of God. Antony Flew was persuaded more recently from the developments of science to actually give up his atheism, and he wrote a book called There Is a God, and it's very fascinating to read that book because he describes fine-tuning as one of the conditions or one of the factors that helped him to think that there's probably an intelligence that created the universe. Now, for the sake of modesty and to appeal to a broad audience, I'm not going to assume that for this step. For my purposes, I'm going to say the foundation somehow has matter-making resources. It's able to make the universe such that we can exist in it somehow. Okay, foundation of morals. So we live in a world where there's not only minds, there's not only conscious beings, but there's interactions between conscious beings. Beings experience a drama of life. We engage each other in combat. We have an experience of good and bad, right and wrong. This is a very specific kind of consciousness. If you think about a random reality with random consciousness, you might imagine that this reality might include things like the feeling of cold or the feeling of hot. But would you expect it to include the feeling of good, the feeling of hope, purpose, the feeling that somebody's done something wrong? It seems like not only is there consciousness, but there's also a moral sense, and there are agents, moral agents that exist, who exist in the world and can interact. Some philosophers have argued that in order for there to be a moral sense, a moral quality to things, there again has to be something in the foundation that's going to explain that. Perhaps in terms of an intention to create a world in which there are moral beings that can interact with each other in interesting ways. I personally find that very compelling. But for the sake of modesty and to appeal to a broad audience, I'm going to just say for this step that the foundation at least has some resources, some capacity for making moral agents. So in the unfolding of reality, moral agents can arise. All right, foundations of math and reason. Just very briefly, some philosophers have argued that mathematics depends in some way on mental activity. One way of thinking about this is that you might think that mathematical propositions, like the proposition that 2 + 2 = 4, or the proposition that nothing can be both square and not square at the same time, that propositions have their home in thoughts. That propositions don't exist without some kind of a thought. You might think of a proposition as a content of a thought. Other philosophers, adding to this idea, have argued that mathematics has a kind of necessity to it. So if you take David Woodruff's logic exams, the correct answers to those logic exams don't vary from day to day. It's not like if you take his exam on Tuesday, the answers are different than when you take it on Wednesday. I mean, he might give you a different exam, but the actual laws of logic are the same every day of the week. And so some have argued that the nature of logic itself has a kind of necessity to it, and this maybe suggests that there's a kind of necessary mind that is able to contain these propositional abstract forms. Well, I'm actually not so sure about that, and I want to appeal to a broad audience and be as modest as I can. So I'm going to just say the foundation has rational thought-making resources. Okay, that's all that's required for this step, that the foundation is able to create a reality in which beings emerge. So now we've made it through towards the end of the bridge of reason. There's just one final step left, and this is the treasure. So I want to be careful about how I'm going to label the treasure, because I actually want the label to come second, to be second. I want us to think just with new eyes, with a kind of fresh curiosity, what could possibly be foundational? And I offer you this question that can unlock insight. What is the simplest, least arbitrary theory of fundamental reality that can account for its having the resources to make mind, matter, morals, reason, etc.? So in science, we often will look for the simplest explanation of the data. If it's raining outside and you don't really, well, let's say it's wet outside and you think it was raining, but it's not raining anymore. You don't see that it's raining, but the rain hypothesis is a nice simple hypothesis that would explain what you do see. Of course, you could come up with another hypothesis, right? Like, so maybe instead there were some aliens that came by and dropped some water on one place on the grass, and then some kids came by and put some cups of water in another part of the grass. You could have a very long, complex hypothesis. Again, you don't see that the hypothesis is true. It explains the data, but it's not the simplest explanation. So other things being equal, if we prefer the simplest explanation, that's going to be the most probable theory, the most probable hypothesis. So this is my question. What is the simplest description of fundamental reality that would account for its having all of these great powers? Now, let me just say that I have not seen a simpler theory than the one I'm going to present to you. I've not even seen a simpler theory proposed or debated. But it's an open challenge. Maybe some of you watching by video, or some of you in the audience, might come up with a simpler theory that can explain all these things. Now, if you do come up with a simpler theory, it needs to compete with the theory that I'm about to offer. If it doesn't compete with it, then it could actually reinforce it, because there might be different descriptions of the basic reality. So here's my hypothesis, or my theory. I call it the supreme nature hypothesis. It's that the foundation has a supreme nature. By a supreme nature, what I mean is that it is the greatest kind of thing that could be thought. It's the greatest kind of nature. My thought is that the greatest kind of nature is going to have the greatest concentration of great properties, including knowledge, power, the power to produce conscious beings, the power to form a world with agents that can interact. This is a nice simple hypothesis. It doesn't have a lot of conceptual components to it. It's sort of easy to grasp. When I was in graduate school, one of my advisors, it was actually Alvin Planiga, said to me that across the world, people, even if they're raised in atheist cultures, will tend to form some kind of higher being hypothesis because there's a kind of simplicity to it, or kind of a supreme being hypothesis, because it's a simple hypothesis, and it can kind of unify different perspectives across the different cultures. So let me kind of reinforce this a little bit with an argument. The foundation has great powers as a foundation for great things, has the power to produce matter, conscious beings, a world with moral agents. It lacks arbitrary limits. This was that abstract step. Remember the turtle argument, a very important step. So philosophers were supposed to be skeptical, but I've become unskeptical of the ability to see that limits and boundaries have to depend on something prior. At this point, I have some conviction on this point. I would say it's possible to know for sure that the foundational reality can't have these arbitrary limits or boundaries. It can't be a tree or a book or a porcupine or something like this, because it has to be unlimited. That's the purely actual step. Whatever has great powers without arbitrary limits has a supreme nature. We could talk about this from different angles, but one idea is that if it has anything less than a supreme nature, then it has some particular limits that are implied by that lack of greatness. It's less than the greatest kind of thing. That's going to imply some limits or boundaries. It doesn't have limits or boundaries, so therefore the foundation has a supreme nature. Therefore, there is a supreme foundation. And we could use the word God now to label this. But I want to be careful here, because many times people will have associations of God with certain things that maybe God is greater than those things. Like for myself, I think that I've kind of had maybe an anthropomorphism where I would kind of project sort of human qualities. Maybe not a human body, but I would sort of think, God is like some great human. And I've wondered, if we were butterflies and God showed up to display his nature to us, he might show up as a butterfly so we can know him in a way that we can understand. But it wouldn't mean that his fundamental essence is literally a butterfly. The butterfly is a form that represents something greater. And so I'm convinced that if God exists, God's greatness is not contained by any particular form, including any particular human form. And maybe rolling away some obstacles to the existence of God can come from just even carving away some concepts of God. I want to kind of leave open here how this might be filled in more detail. So because I want to appeal to a broad audience, I want to offer briefly 3 keys for every truth seeker. You might not agree with the particular steps that I took on this journey. That's okay, but all of you have treasures of truth for yourself and for others. And all of you can build a bridge to those treasures. 3 keys that I've found very helpful for truth seekers. First, aim for truth. Make that your goal. The truth may not be what you wanted it to be, but actually maybe it's greater than what you wanted it to be. That was my experience. The view that I had of the nature of reality was too small, was too limited. It needed to break. It needed to be shattered so I could actually see something greater, more beautiful. Aim for the truth. Look for truths that are actually going to be valuable to people, that are treasures for people. Don't just aim for truths that build you up, that make you, don't aim for just trivial truths that make you appear clever or something like this. Look for truths that are going to be treasures. And then use your powers, use your tools, use your lights. So you are a leader of your own journey. A final thought. As I've been thinking about the nature of reality, I would say in the last few years, and maybe even just in the last year, I've become increasingly interested in the fact that it looks like you yourself are a special window into reality. I think earlier in my career, I was looking like outside of myself, like the edges of the universe. I'm using reason as a telescope to investigate the landscape of logical connections, like outside of me. But as I was working on my latest book on the nature and origin of persons, I began to realize that there are special treasures within us that point to the great foundation. To see the great treasure of existence, look within. Within you are many treasures, complex matter, self-repairing technologies. I mean, if your skin breaks, it starts to repair itself. This is pretty special. Feelings, the power to reason, the sense of value, and so much more. These things are so familiar, but they're also not thereby insignificant. They're very significant. These familiar things within you, I believe, are clues to the great value of your life and the nature of the ultimate foundation within you. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. If you have questions, it's kind of a small room, so you probably just raise your hand. I love this question. So what you're pointing to is this idea of like causes like. And so you might be able to think that, the foundation of reality has to have a mind in order to produce minds. It has to have a moral nature in order to produce moral beings. This is a like causes like principle. And actually, I don't accept that principle. At least that's not a principle that I'm using in my arguments. In my most recent book, I realized I need to say this explicitly. So I describe the like causes like principle, and then I say, no, I'm not going to use this principle. Instead, I wanted to take a modest approach in this presentation where I'm going to just say that the foundation has some resources to produce these things, and we'll leave open the nature of the foundation. And it's only in the last step that I try to find what's the simplest hypothesis to explain how it has all those resources. It's a little bit of a different approach. However, I would also argue for the intelligence of the foundation, not from a like causes like principle, but rather to explain the kinds of things that intelligent beings do. So let me just draw this out a bit. If I send you an email, okay, you receive some text. That text is basically just shapes. It's not that you're going to infer that from seeing these shapes that the cause must be shapes. Instead, you're going to infer something that's unlike the effect, intelligence. Now, why are you going to infer intelligence? Like there was someone who sent you the email. There was some mind behind the email. You're going to infer that because that email is more likely to exist if there's some mind behind it than if there's no mind behind it. So that's not based on like causes like at all. And same thing with the fine-tuning. My thought would be that the universe is finely tuned for life. That's way more likely if there's some intelligence than if there's not an intelligence. Same with the emergence of moral agents. If the foundational reality is completely mindless, that doesn't give me any sort of anticipation that moral agents would ever emerge. But if the foundation of reality is itself a moral agent, I think that increases the probability that it would be interested in connection, relationship, in moral agency. So I love the question just so much because I've gotten a lot of feedback kind of based on that there's this like causes like principle that I think sometimes people think that's doing the work. And let's just roll that principle away. We could destroy it even if we wanted to. Just don't use it. But there are other principles that are doing the work in these arguments. Thank you. What else? Yes? Great question. So you're asking, and do clarify if I'm summarizing this right. So what steps would help somebody go forward with getting to the truth, even if maybe it's not like what they would want to believe? Right? How would you do that practically? Yeah, thank you. A few things that I found personally helpful. One would be to read people who disagree with me and to read them with an eye to enter into their perspective, not with an eye to just object. So just looking at the people who are saying things against maybe what I would think is true. So that's one step. Another step is to look at the people who are interested in whatever question it is that you're interested in, people who are working on that, and go read what they're saying about that, or go talk with them, go investigate that. I think a third idea, in addition to looking into the relevant literature and looking at the other side, would be to pay attention to those intellectual virtues. I feel like this is maybe the most important thing, is to kind of be self-aware. Are you being intellectually curious? Are you willing to be wrong? Are you being careful in your investigation? And I think that can involve self-awareness, but it can also involve asking others for feedback and seeing how other people are perceiving you. And they can kind of help you to gauge, are you actually pursuing the truth carefully with sort of that willingness to be wrong? So those are things that I've personally found helpful to get to the truth, and to never stop. It's not like, well, now you just arrived, but to continue to be curious, to continue to look at things from new angles. I think so. So I've got a couple things on this. So the question is, is my conclusion that there's a supreme foundation strong enough to explain all of the effects that we see, the matter, the mind, the morals, or do we need a stronger conclusion that's going to give us the personality or personhood of the foundation? And I've got two things I want to say about this. So first, I like the modesty because it does invite, I think, fresh curiosity. I think sometimes people who are seeing maybe an argument for the existence of God, right? God, then if you have too strong of a conclusion, it can sometimes take away that curiosity. I think it's a great thing if whether you believe in God or not, there's a foundational substance or stuff, and now we can investigate more about its nature. So I think that's already very, very valuable all in its own right. And I think sometimes people have maybe resisted some steps in the argument, sort of thinking that it's leading to this great conclusion, and it doesn't actually have to get there. Okay, that's the first thing. But the second thing, to your point, I actually think that you're right, actually, that the concept of a supreme nature, what I mean there is it's the greatest kind of thing that could be thought to be. And it seems to me that if it's merely a mindless substrate, then I could think of a greater kind of thing, which has the powers of a mind. And then that would give us the predictive success that's going to predict the mind-making resources. So in the end, I actually do think we can get that stronger conclusion from this argument. I think it does give us a supreme being. Yeah.
May I ask a follow-up?
Go ahead, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I also think interesting, the sort of maximal being, theology there that's added on the end is really interesting. But do you feel like that's a sort of added component, or do you feel like it kind of grows out of the other premises that you were describing before?
I would say that is it growing out of the premises, in the sense that if I unpack what I mean by supreme nature, I mean a nature of something that is the greatest kind of thing there could be. So I mean that kind of maximally great reality or being in that sense. The maximally great something is how I should say it. That's what I mean by that. And then my thought is, if it's anything less, that's going to imply some particular limit or boundary with respect to its value or greatness. And so that we can wonder, well, why is it that great rather than greater or lesser? Well, that needs to have a cause or explanation given the purely actual step, that it can't have arbitrary edges or boundaries. So this is where, in the How Reason Can Lead to God, I really take some time to draw out why I think the foundational reality has to be maximally great. Well, since writing that book, I've updated my thoughts in certain ways, and even thinking about how to conceive of maximal greatness. One of the things that's become clearer to me is that I want to think of a maximally great being as a maximally great kind of thing. It's a kind of thing, it's a category of thing. It's not just like there's a degree that you can take all the way to infinite. I don't think it even is an infinite degree. It's not that. It's the kind of thing that can't, such that there's no possible greater. And so, yeah, I would say that does grow out of the steps of my argument. Absolutely. Okay. Thank you.
Logical boundaries.
Yeah. This is a very, very perceptive question. So the question is, could the foundation of reality have some boundaries that are not arbitrary, but they're purposeful? There's some maybe explanation for those boundaries. I've got a couple thoughts about this. So my current view on this is that the only boundaries that are going to exist are going to be ones that are produced in some way. So they aren't going to be in its essence, in its core nature. So for example, if it takes the form of a butterfly, for example, and it experiences certain boundaries, that's not part of its essence, but it's something that it can experience, perhaps, by producing that form and then experiencing that form. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is it's very interesting, the idea that there could be a kind of mathematical or logical landscape built into the fabric of reality, just into the essence of the foundational reality, just this eternal mathematical reality. And I'm open to that, and I want to allow for that. What I want to say is that I wouldn't call this a limit in the sense of being an edge or a boundary that could be surpassed, or could be, it's not like the size of a tree where you could conceive without contradiction a taller tree. It's not like that. It's just the total of mathematical reality is maybe part of it. And I wouldn't call it a limit if it can't fail to obey its own nature. I find it helpful to distinguish between two kinds of limits. So one kind of limit, which I'm not going to actually call a limit, it would be constraints based on its greatness. It's because it's so great that it's rational, it's logical. I'm not calling that a limit. The second kind of limit, which is what I would call a limit, which is relevant to the argument, would be some kind of like finite boundary or edge, and where then you can ask, well, why does it have that boundary or that edge? Why is it, that shape rather than a different shape? So that would be my answer to that question, that absolutely there could be purposeful explanations of limits, but those are going to be produced and caused, in my view. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Anybody else? Go ahead, please. But I love this question so much. Okay, so the question is, if the simplest explanation, does the simplest explanation of the foundation imply that the foundation is a simple being? This takes some reflection. I don't think there's an easy answer to the question. Some people have argued that the foundational reality is simple. But some have argued, I don't think this is required for the argument. So you could have a simple hypothesis that implies complexity. So it's a kind of a matter of debate. The foundational reality is maximally great or is a supreme being. Does that imply that it actually has a variety of parts? The parts aren't foundational to making it what it is, but they're interior to it in some sense. That's a matter of debate. My own view is that the foundational nature, and this is actually a view that I've come to just in the last couple of years, so I'll just share my view, is that the foundational nature of the foundational reality is purely simple. So that is the view that I've come to, but it's not required for the argument, if that makes sense. Yeah. So then in that case, my thought would be that the personhood of the foundation would be broader. I mean, this is actually related to the anthropomorphism problem. Absolutely. That it has a pure awareness, a pure consciousness. It creates details.
So it's a person, but not like a person like you and me.
Exactly, yes.
That creates new problems.
Yeah. Good problems. Good problems, because then we're not thinking of God as limited to be the kind of beings that we think we are. We make God out of our own image. We think, oh, this is the anthropomorphism that I think leads people to become skeptical of the existence of God. Because at least this is my experience. It's like, okay, look, human beings, step outside of your culture. Don't you see what you've been doing? You've been projecting yourself out into the thunder. So you think there's a God of thunder that's kind of like you, right? And then, science gave us the explanation of the thunder. So now you're going to project a superhuman being behind the universe, right? That's all anthropomorphism. And I think that I very much appreciate the skeptical argument that actually maybe there's not a being that's in our image. Like maybe if God is really real, maybe if the foundation really is supreme, we're in its image. And we don't complete it. We don't have all of it. So it's the full being. It has all of the resources for all of the personalities. It's trans-personality, if I can use that language. But that doesn't mean that it's not conscious. It's not personal in the broad sense. That doesn't limit it, define it as limited like us. You don't look convinced, David. All right, well, fair enough. We could keep chatting about this.
Yes, we will.
Appreciate that. Yes, absolutely. You could think, so the question is my support for a foundation just a principle of sufficient reason, but a more modest version of it? And yes, I would say that. So the principle of sufficient reason, one formulation of that would be that every fact has some sufficient explanation of that fact. Another way of thinking about this is maybe every contingent fact has some explanation of the contingent fact. Here I had it, yes, more modest. It's just other things being equal, basically explain things as far as you can. When in doubt, expect an explanation. And that's a very modest form of the principle of sufficient reason. And many people that I know who are skeptical of the principle of sufficient reason accept that premise. And so I find it very helpful. In a way, what that premise does is it makes the argument a bit more modest, because it's basically saying, here we have some good reason to expect an explanation of contingent things, of edges, of boundaries. We have some good reason, but it leaves open the possibility that somebody could come along and say, hey, here's a reason to think that this blue sphere could not possibly be explained, and so therefore it's like part of the foundation. Then I'm open to that, right? So it's like other things being equal, explain it further. Yep.
Thank you all for coming. Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.